I want you to hear this joke. I think it's pretty good. There was a man in this pastor's congregation that was always challenging the pastor's theology. Oh, this man was such a skeptic, and every week at the end of the service, the man would always enter into this theology that the pastor would be so frustrated and didn't want to say anything. And finally, the pastor was preaching on miracles, and of course the man goes back and he says, I've got a real problem with your theology of miracles. And the pastor had it and went like whap and kicked him right in the shin. And the man said, oh my gosh. He said, well, did that hurt? And he said, well, yeah, it hurt. And he goes, well, if it didn't hurt, it would have been a miracle. Today, the Jews in the gospel lesson, the Jews are questioning Jesus. Who are you? Aren't you going to ever tell us? And Jesus said, aren't you looking at my works? Doesn't my work speak for me? And there was lots of skepticism and cynicism in that Jewish community. They were always, prodding Jesus and mocking him and questioning his authority. And we get that. But I want to say there's still skepticism and cynicism in the church, where people are mocking and questioning our own works, our Christianity. I was thinking about how a lot of people in the church talk about other people in the church, like the Jews were saying, I don't see anything here. People of God were not seeing the things of God. I read this story about a family who sued a church. They were members there for 2 years, or they attended there for 2 years, and they said that the people didn't act like Jesus. They weren't kind like Jesus. They weren't generous like Jesus. And so they sued them for all the money they had given the church, all their tithe for 2 years, and they had it all figured out. They had given the pastor a gift a couple times, and they wanted that back. And some other things that they gave for ministries, they wanted it all back, and there was an amount there. And they filed a suit. Skepticism and cynicism in the church. I just read this article that we're interviewing Marcus Mumford. Does anyone know him? I think Mumford & Sons are really a new group. I like their music. But in Rolling Stone magazine, he was quoted. He did an article about his music and about who he was. And here, he's a son of the founder of the Vineyard Church in the UK. And they asked him about his Christian lyrics because he has wonderful Christian lyrics. And he says he does not profess to be a Christian. And let me say what he says. He says, it comes with so much baggage. So no, I wouldn't call myself a Christian. I think the word just conjures up all these religious images that I don't really like. I have my personal views about the person of Jesus, who he was. Like, you ask a Muslim, they'll say Jesus was awesome. They're not Christians, but they still love Jesus. He said, so I've kind of separated myself from the culture of Christianity. I was really shocked to hear that. And it reminded me of this joke. The little boy said, I love you, Mommy, and when I grow up, I'm going to buy you a fur coat and a diamond ring and a really fancy car. Oh, the mother said, that's really nice. And then a couple days later, she was scolding him, and he goes, forget the fur coat. That reminded me of Marcus Mumford and the people who were suing the church. A lot of times, people get disappointed in what's going on at the church, and they walk away. I'm going to take my ball, and I'm going to go. I'm not going to be with you anymore. See, Jesus was saying today, look, you have seen and heard all that I have done, and you still don't believe. The sheep know me. They know my voice. Jesus was saying, my people know me. Why don't you enter the gates and come and know who I am? Know me as the shepherd. I know you want to. There's something holding them back. Experience God and enter in. You want to experience God? Come and enter in. It reminded me of taglines that I saw for States. States always, Napanee has a tagline, embrace the pace. It's a toughie, embracing the pace. But you have to because there's so many carriages. Well, here's a couple. Do you want to be wild and wonderful? Come to West Virginia. That reminds you of Burl, right? You want your life elevated? Come to Utah. Do you want to have a different look at things? Things look different here, Oregon. Those are just a few. So I say, Jesus says, I think today, experience God and enter in. Do you want to experience God? Then enter in the life of Christ. Come follow me. Don't stand there. Take responsibility for knowing the shepherd. Don't stand there and ask me to spoon feed it to you. Sometimes you have to lay down your stuff. You know, we heard about Peter. He could have walked away in many instances. When Jesus said, "Get thee behind me, Satan," one time to Peter, he could have walked away. Or he could have walked away when he denied Christ because he was so brokenhearted. He could have walked away. He could have said, I'm done with this. And sometimes we have to take responsibility for what we are doing and who we are in Christ. I was really offended when I read that Marcus Mumford piece. I was thinking, that's not a very good proclamation of who Christ is. Don't live in other people's experiences. Come and experience God with me, yourself. Don't stand there and ask. Don't complain. Don't be critical and cynical. Come and be a part of what God is doing all around us. Sometimes we do miss that. Enter in. The early churches had the same issues. If you read the letters of Paul, everybody was chaos, and Christians were just trying to make their way. I was thinking I would like to take a look at Peter and Dorcas. Peter, like I said, could have left any time. And they entered into the life of Christ. And things were happening because they were following the lead of Christ. They listened to his teachings, they saw what he did, and they acted. Responding with compassion, both of them. Dorcas, it said Dorcas was devoted to good works and acts of charity. All the widows stood beside Peter whenever she was dead, weeping and showing tunics and other clothing that Dorcas had made while she was with them. They were lamenting, look what she's done, look what she's doing. She's made all these things, she's caring for us, please, we need her. This Dorcas was somebody that was reflecting what she had learned from Christ. Don't you remember Jesus at the temple treasury, and the widow put her money in, and everyone was giving lots of money, but this widow gave everything that she had. Jesus was teaching us about who to care for and who to have compassion for, and Dorcas was listening. Dorcas wasn't saying, they need help over there, and nobody is helping them. Nobody is caring for them. Dorcas was someone that entered in. There was a Guatemala City in the late 80s uprising, and the government just took over the farmers, the indigenous farmers who were illiterate, and they were slaughtering them. Thousands of people, men and women and children. And then even some of the men, they were abducted and they disappeared forever, leaving all their wives and families behind. And so the family, the widows and their children didn't have anything to do, so they migrated towards the city. And when we got there, the Presbyterian Missions came forward to help them. And they helped them form themselves a group. And they had this will to survive. And they wanted to see their children grow up. And the missions entered in and they created this building. They built this building for them where every kind of need, any health need that these widows had, any child care that these widows needed, preschool for these children of the widows. They even trained some of these widows to be hygienists and nurse practitioners. Great disciples of compassion. That's who we are. That's who Jesus has called us to be. It reminds me of this story I heard probably a few years back about these grandmothers that had it with this gang-infested neighborhood in New York City. And along with their church and their community activists, they acquired an apartment building, and these grandmothers and their grandchildren that they were caring for lived in this apartment building, and they became a community that cared for each other. And when one child was not going down the right path, any grandmother could go in and be the grandparent to those children because they had this desire to bring a peace to their neighborhood. Compassion. Just entering in and experience God firsthand. I know many of you have these kind of ministries of your own, and I could go on and name them, but you know what they are, where God has called you into a place that you know there's a need. And your heart says, yes, let me care for that. And Peter with his compassion comes at once. And the story is almost exactly like the story of Jairus' daughter, where Jesus heals the little girl. And Peter puts out his hand, lifts her up, and she walks on like Jairus' daughter. Exactly. This healing compassion that Jesus has taught us. There's no room for skepticism. There's no room for cynicism. There's only room for work of Jesus. It reminded me of the Center for Healing and Hope, where there was a need. And compassion for the marginalized, just as Jesus did. And their call to address the physical, the mental, the social, and the spiritual needs of the patients and integrate them into the local healthcare community, to share Christ's love while providing medical care for the uninsured and underserved in the community. See, I think with Marcus Mumford and the people that were going to sue the church, how could they have been experiencing God and entering in when they're just looking at the downside of things? How could they not see the goodness in God? Because they were looking on the wrong side. They were standing on the sidelines, pointing their fingers. And Jesus says to us today, enter in through the gate. I'm the shepherd. Know my voice. You can experience God's goodness and mercy. Psalm 23 is the psalm for the lectionary this week. See, that's the good news. The good news is we are just listening for the shepherd's voice and moving in compassion, but it's God's work in and through us that's doing it. When they stand on the sidelines and say that there's something wrong, I don't see Christians being who Christians are. That's their own need. Those are their own expectations. Jesus says, I'm all you will need. And we keep our eyes on Jesus. mercy and goodness will be abound us. Mercy and goodness will follow our works. We'll leave a wake of mercy and goodness in everything that we touch. We don't stand out and say, well, we should be doing this and we should be doing that and they're not doing this, and it's easy. Like I was saying, I judged Marcus Mumford for his words. Carries a lot of clout. But for God, we have to remember, Jesus says, if you can't believe me, believe God. These are his work. These are God's works. We have to remember this is God's power and God's strength that moves us to action. This is God's compassion in us. This is God's love in us. This is God's mercy, God's faithfulness, God's kindness. This is God in us, not us. God in us that's moving us to do the works of Jesus. When we do that, we leave those skeptics and we leave those cynics up to God. And we just do what God calls us to do. Enter through the gate, experience God, and enter in to what God is leading you to do. Amen.